Welcome to today's webinar, Knowing Your Hazards, Warehouse and Retail Fire Safety. My name is Renee Noonan and I will be your moderator today. Go ahead and click, Brian. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some tools that will help. Please connect your audio by using the microphone icon you see on the slide. Click the drop-down arrow and select your speakers. We will hold all questions until the presentation is completed. Please enter any questions you have in the Q&A pod you will see at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead. Our first speaker is Vali Murray, Fire and Safety Hazard Material Manager at Lowe's. Vali has been with Lowe's for 3.5 years and is a member of the Hazmat and Environmental Compliance team under Lowe's Asset Protection Department. Vali has held multiple positions in fire and life safety throughout his career. In his role, Vali supports both Lowe's stores as well as their supply chain locations. Vali is primarily tasked with ensuring Lowe's regulatory responsibilities are handled in a professional manner. Next. Our next speaker is Matt Klaus, Senior Principal Fire Protection Engineer Director of Technical Services at NFPA. Matt is responsible for product and services related to fire protection engineering. Matt Klaus has extensive international fire protection engineer consulting experience. He has served as the author-editor of several handbooks on topics including fire sprinkler design and installation, commissioning and integrated systems testing, ITM, inspection testing and maintenance, and residential sprinkler system design and installation. Matt holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering and a Master's of Science degree in Fire Protection Engineering, both from Worcester Polytech Institute, and a Master's in Business Administration from the University of Massachusetts. Our next speaker is Brian O'Connor, Technical Services Engineer at NFPA and past president of New England chapter of Society of Protection Engineers. Brian is a professional engineer registered in the state of Texas and Massachusetts. He earned his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Rowan University and a master's degree in fire protection engineering from the University of Maryland. At NFPA, he focuses on topics such as aviation, portable extinguishers, water-based fire protection, energy storage systems, and healthcare facilities. Before I turn things over to Brian, I would like to read a brief message about recording. This webinar is being recorded on behalf of the National Fire Protection Association. This recording will become the property of the NFPA and may be used by NFPA for any lawful purpose. By participating in or attending this event, you agree to be recorded and to allow NFPA to use such recordings for any lawful purpose. If you do not wish to be recorded, please hang up or exit the meeting at this time. And now I'd like to hand things over to Brian, who will now begin the presentation. Go ahead, Brian.
All right. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for having me. Appreciate the introduction. A lot of good information there. So today we're going to talk about warehouse fire protection. And here you can see on the screens a quick agenda for today. So first we'll talk a bit about NFPA, who we are and what we do. Then we'll go into some different statistics and even a case study review looking at warehouse fires and kind of looking at some trends, what's changed year over year, as well as some repercussions from what happens when we do have a fire in warehouses. From there, we'll move on to fire and life safety considerations for warehouse and retail locations. So we understand that warehouses are unique environments, and so what makes them unique from a fire and life safety protection perspective. After that, we'll look at just the fire protection in warehouses in general, giving us a broad overview of the different systems and components that make up our sprinkler systems, our fire alarm systems, as well as other life safety features we might find. And then looking at what level of detail, do we want different levels of employees and things like that to know about these systems. And at the very end, we'll wrap up with just some NFPA resources that are available in case you do want to learn more. We'll review those. All right, so without further ado, we can get started. All right, so for those of you who don't know, NFPA, we're a global nonprofit devoted to limiting death, injury, property, and economic loss due to fire, electrical, and related hazards. Now, that statement's going to ring very true when we start looking at these warehouses. And, we are trying to prevent both death, or all death, injury, property, and economic loss. And once we go into those statistics, we can kind of look at what that actually means and what those numbers mean. But a lot of people know NFPA. We're known as a standards development organization, but we do much more than that. So while we do support development, adoption, and enforcement of codes and standards, we also look at the research and data analysis. And this is something that the next couple of slides will talk about, because we're going to be looking at, we want to know more about fire trends and what we can do to help, further our mission. And if anything is working, what we can relate to those numbers. We also do training and certification, which we'll talk a bit about at the end of this as part of some of the resources. But in addition to those, we do different public education. We have public education campaigns. We have Fire Protection Week, which is our annual campaign that addresses different fire themes and promotes that. We have Learn Not to Burn, addressing injuries and death among children and trying to prevent those. Remembering When, trying to address the leading causes of injuries and death among older adults, as well as outreach and advocacy that we do. We have different fire sprinkler initiatives. We also have a program called the FireWise Community Program that helps, different communities be more wildfire resilient. So again, just kind of a big overview of NFPA as well. We have a lot of codes and standards, and that's a lot of what we talk about, but we do more than that. And there's a lot more if you go on our website to look around at. All right. So let's dive into some statistics. Recently, there's been a 2022 warehouse structure fires report publicly available. So you can go on our NFPA research and data analytics division page, and you'll be able to find this. It's a PDF, it's downloadable. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit through it and give us some highlights about what's going on. So the data comes from 2016 to 2020. So this is kind of the period that we're looking over. The previous one we've done was published in 2017, and I believe it covered 2005 to 2015-ish timeframe. It's gathered using the National Fire Incident Reporting System. So this captures all fire department responses and allows us to make database decisions with our trying to figure out improvements for the fire service as well as the built environment around it. This is something NFPA hosts with the U.S. Fire Administration. And then let's look at what actually happened. So year over year, on average, we had 1,450 structure fires at warehouse properties. Now, this is a significant increase from our last report, and last data we looked at that was published in 2017. It increased from 1,300 to 1,450. So a little bit of an increase there. But where we're really going to see the increase is when we look at the actual property damage that was caused. Annually, it's 283 million. In our last report, it was only 157 million per year. And so that's almost doubling the amount of property damage that's happening due to these fires. We can try to look into what's causing this. What are the reasons for that? So we're having a little bit more fires. So we're having more fires, but we're having a lot more damage. So for each fire, there's a lot more damage that happens. There's also, when we're looking at the average of 2 civilian deaths and 16 civilian injuries each year, this has decreased from the last time that we've done this report. So that is a good sign. It's decreased from 3 civilian deaths to 2 annually, and then from 22 injuries each year down to 16 injuries. So it's good that we're moving in the right direction with that, although we still care about property and economic loss. And so that's something that we're struggling with warehouse fires. All right, so a couple more statistics. The first one there is warehouse fires that were, trash and rubbish fires make up 15% of all the fires that happened. And when we look at these, we can say, okay, well, they're typically not large loss fires unless they spread, but a lot of those fires were contained to, the surrounding area and maybe some smoke damage. So although that makes up a larger percentage of the fires, it's a pretty small percent of the actual damage that was done. Now we can look at the direct property damage, which is something that we look at. We care about how much damage is done per fire. So ones that were related to fires ignited by electrical distribution and lighting equipment account for 31% of all direct property damage, which is a huge number, especially considering the item right below that only 18% of all fires were ignited by electrical distribution and lighting equipment. So although it only accounted for 18% of fires, it accounted for 31% of direct property damage, meaning that these electrical fires are causing higher loss because they might be encased in walls, they might be in areas where people aren't readily available or people don't go often. So there can be a lot of conclusions that can be drawn by that. Something else to look at is this pie chart here, that although only 18% of fires occurred between midnight and 6 a.m., those fires accounted for 45% of direct property damage by fires occurring between that midnight and 6 a.m. That means, again, not a large percentage of those fires, but a large loss for those fires, which means maybe there's less people around to be able to quickly extinguish small incipient fires before they grow out of hand. Ultimately can't draw too many conclusions from these statistics, but they do shed some light on trends that we have to keep an eye out for. All right, and then as I mentioned, if you want to learn more about these statistics, you can dive into everything that we have. It's a PDF that's available for download absolutely free on our website. We'll check that out and we'll provide a link at the very end of this presentation for where you can find more of that. Okay. The next thing we want to talk about is a case study. It's just looking at kind of the repercussions from these fires. So this was a massive fire and it occurred in the fulfillment center for a major retailer in Plainsfield, Indiana. And if you work in the warehouse fire protection field a lot, you're probably aware of this. It happened in March 16th of 2022, so fairly recently. And it was a huge facility. It was 1.2 million square feet. Comparing that to the size of football fields, it's about 20 football fields. So a large area. And when we look at these fires, we look at more than just the loss for the retailers, which is something that's significant because that also gives us an economic loss. We look at the impact it has on the first responders. It takes up a lot of resources that might be needed elsewhere. We also look at the local economy. We look at people who might have lost their jobs. And we also look at the health of the surrounding environment. If one of these huge fire happens, it affects more than just the retailer. It has a resounding effect. So as we look at some more of these statistics here, we had 350 firefighters responding to this incident. And the closure of the facility, because ultimately it did close, impacted over 1,000 employees. And that's going to have a real effect on just the economy of the local area. And there are also a lot of health concerns for the surrounding areas due to different smoke and debris that have lingered for a long time. And that's not exactly the healthiest stuff to breathe in. So a lot of these things are things that we want to prevent, right? None of these are good outcomes. So yeah, this is something that we've been looking at and trying to, not this specific case, but trying to look in general. We want these fires to not happen, right? We want to be able to prevent these as much as possible. And then before we move on, I did want to ask Vali a quick question about his perspective. Vali has a very unique perspective, different than NFPA, because he lives and works and breathes a lot of warehouse fire protection, working over at Lowe's. So Vali, if you don't mind chiming in, do you have any perspective on, maybe firefighter relationships with the company or things like that you might jump in with?
Yeah, I sure do. I apologize. I'm actually having some trouble with my camera, but just to move things along, I think until the technology is developed where we know exactly when and where a fire is going to occur, we're kind of starting off behind the curve, right? So the most proactive approach we can take is by inviting these fire departments into our buildings, right? And what I mean by that is encourage fire departments to conduct pre-plans, right? Allow them to do training, walk them through your evacuation procedures, show them where critical fire detection and suppression equipment is located. At the end of the day, we not only want them to understand, but to be a part of our day-to-day operation. Lowe's is consistently conducting outreach within our communities. In fact, every October, we offer first responders from around the country to use our store locations as a platform to offer classes, training, and even host demonstrations for the public. So I'd encourage all on this call to start developing those critical relationships with our first responders.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely a great point. Just looking at the size of these facilities too, that's something that, you might not necessarily know where everything is. It's not within eye shot, right? It's not necessarily apparent unless you've been coordinating, unless you've been trying to work with the organizations, knowing that, pre-planning, and trying to figure out when an event does happen, where can I go, what to do. And as Vali mentioned, you're right, we're not always going to know exactly where that fire is. So being able to find that, especially in these, again, huge warehouses, is going to be difficult for first responders. So making their job, they already have a tough job, making it as easy as possible is really going to be beneficial for the community, the environment, the retailers themselves. So it's going to have a lot of good effects. All right. So next thing I wanted to talk about, and I might spend a little bit of time on this slide, is warehouses are unique in a lot of ways, and they offer a ton of benefits. That's why we use them, right? That's why we have so many warehouses around. So we're going to look at some of the benefits that a warehouse or retail location might provide, but then along with those, benefits, they also come with different safety complications or different things that we'd have to consider just to make sure that we are keeping everyone safe, keeping the building safe, and trying to prevent loss. So I'll kind of go through this slide itself. So basically, warehouses are used to store products, right? And they do it really efficiently. And they typically do that by stacking items vertically and stacking them pretty densely, right? Because it costs money for square footage. So we're going to use that to the best of your ability, which gives us a very dense fuel load stacked vertically, which means that big fires can happen. Heat, rises. Fire likes to travel vertically much quicker than it would travel horizontally. So all this does lead to saying, okay, we have the potential for these big fires in these facilities. We have a huge fuel load, and we have a good opportunity for fire to travel. So understanding that is something that we want to look at as we look at our life safety and fire protection systems. But also when we're stacking and storing all of our goods and materials, we really need to make sure that the storage does not obstruct our safety systems. That means that we're not obstructing means of egress, ways to get out of the building. We're not obstructing the sprinkler discharge. Sprinkler needs to be able to reach where a fire might happen. So if we stack boxes too closely to them, that could become an obstruction, prevent that discharge from reaching the fuel load, and again, maybe allowing that fire to grow quicker than the sprinkler can keep up with. So there are a lot of considerations to look at when we're looking at the storage of products. But also, we're going to store more than one type of product, right? For the most part. For the most part, we're going to have these large warehouses, and there are going to be lots of different goods. So we want to make sure that the building is designed to store those goods in the first place, which, different materials burn differently. As we know, you take a look at, think a glass jar, if you put a glass jar in a cardboard box, a bunch of glass jars, compared to something like another material that's packed with packing peanuts and maybe is made out of wood, they're going to burn a little bit differently. So we want to make sure that when we do change things out from something that doesn't burn quite as well or is a lower hazard to something that's a higher hazard, we want to make sure that the fire protection features, the life safety features, and all of these things are adequate for these higher hazards. So when we're switching them out, it's really important to understand that. As well as there might be separations within your building. You might say this one part of my building is designed for this higher hazard, and therefore we're allowed to store these things there, but other parts might not be. So understanding that there might be separations within your building between where we're going to store things like paint thinner and where we're going to store things like concrete blocks. So we want to make sure that we understand that there are separations, what they do, and what they mean, what they mean for where I can store things. Another unique thing is for, again, more retail locations or retail warehouse, big box store type buildings, the public is going to be able to shop freely throughout the store. That's a great thing, right? They can pick out what they want. They can go to the front register and pay for it. That's how your business works. But it also opens up the possibility for a lot of these safety complications, such as vandalism. We don't want our systems be compromised due to someone who doesn't know the system, who maybe purposely or accidentally, compromises that system. There's also going to be a lot more occupants to evacuate, and these occupants might not be familiar with the layout of the building. They may not be familiar with where all the exits are. They may not be familiar with, how to read a lot of the egress signage or where things are stored. So it just adds another layer of complication. We also can't train the public, right? We can train our employees to know what to do in the event of emergency, but the public doesn't always know that. So then sometimes personnel who work there who are trained might have to help. There's also potential for product to change locations. If I'm trying to buy a lot of paint thinner, right, and I'll use that because it's a flammable product, but I'm putting in my shopping cart, and what if I leave it somewhere else? I get a call and I have to leave the store for whatever reason. I leave that in the corner of a store. I want to make sure that their policy is in place to make sure that that doesn't sit there for a long period of time. Again, distributing that fuel load in a different area. There's also, and unfortunately, a trend happening where fire is being used as a method to steal. And I think this kind of runs into that first bullet of vandalization as well. But people starting fires, filling up their shopping carts, and then starting fires just to be able to walk out with their shopping carts, because then the organization is going to be concerned with stopping that fire, right? And the first responders showing up and trying to prevent someone from stealing. So that's also something to be aware of. And then this last item, when we talk about warehouses being able to change based on seasons or trends or different ownership, that's a great thing, right? It's an asset. I want to be able to sell it if I have to. I want to be able to change it with the trends. If this is no longer a product that's selling, let's change it out. And the same thing, maybe I sell seasonal things. Maybe I sell, hay bales during the fall, and I sell Christmas trees during the winter. And so being able to manage that change of products and the different operations that occur within the facility, just to make sure they don't surpass that limit that we have for our fire and life safety systems, is going to be really important. So all of these things are just great benefits these warehouses provide, but then things to be aware of that might have additional complications. So, and then without further ado, I'll pass it off to Matt Klaus to talk about some of our fire protection approaches and systems that we might see within these facilities.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And thanks everybody for being here. I think, Brian, there's a couple of words that Brian used. I think they're really important. Landscape, to me, is a great way to describe a warehouse or a distribution center or a big box store, because when we look at these spaces, there is a story to them, right? The whole space doesn't act the same. The hazards in each corner and each rack, they vary greatly. So I really do like the idea of looking at a space like this as a landscape and kind of taking a step back and seeing kind of like a bigger view of it than like an individual hazard here or there. The other part of this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about fire protection approaches and mitigation strategies and having a plan for this, is the idea of knowing your hazard. I know a lot of us in the fire protection space and the safety space, we jump right to sprinklers and alarms and detection and all these. The first thing we've got to understand is, what is the hazard? And maybe the active system or the automatic means of intervention through a sprinkler system, that's a great approach. I love them. Maybe it's not always the place to start. And maybe what's driving me isn't the design and installation standard like an NFPA 13. Maybe it's NFPA 30, because I'm dealing with a flammable liquid. So knowing your hazard and knowing your starting point, the way Brian described it is critical, because we deal with the fire protection approach or our intervention or mitigation strategy isn't always the same, right? So being able to, whether you're the building operator or you're an employee within the building, knowing what the hazard is, and when I get in the middle of it and I change something, am I interrupting that mitigation strategy? So I think those are great words, Brian. When I look at what's on the screen now, you got a great image of kind of a pretty traditional big box looking store warehouse environment. This image comes from Link. Link is NFPA's web-based application that houses all of our codes and standards. And then not only does it have the codes and standards, but it's got some great content like this that we would describe as scenario based. If you don't really know what standard to look in, you can search by warehouse. What are all the things in there? It's a great thing in our link platform, our link application. And it highlights real quick, when I look at a warehouse, there's a bunch of different fire protection approaches, right? I've got that automatic intervention with a system like a sprinkler system. And you can see on nodes 1 and 3, we might have ceiling sprinklers, and it's a really robust sprinkler that has a high delivered density, going to put a lot of water out. We might be an environment based on a choice by the owner. We might have solid shelving, and we might require in-rack sprinklers that you see on node number 1, where we're actually going to put the sprinkler really close to the potential fuel source because of the hazard that it carries, right? So we've got to know a little bit going into this. You know, the hazard might dictate where the sprinkler is, how much water I'm going to need. So that automatic intervention is one thing. The physical layout of your space matters. You can see some of the nodes in here, node number 2, node number 7, flue spaces, node number 2. Knowing that we have that gap between the two sides of the racks and in the 2 adjacent aisles, we've got to leave that as clear, right? That's got to allow 2 things to happen. One, when we do have that fire that occurs in the rack, we've got to allow space for the hot gases coming off of the fire to rise up near the sprinkler. That's going to actually, you know, control that fire. Hopefully, in some cases where we're going to try to suppress that fire, depending on the mode we pick. But we've got to leave that free and clear, right? So if I'm a fork truck operator and I've got pallet loads and I'm just loading up racks and I'm hitting, my unit loads are touching back to back and eliminating that flue space, I'm changing the physical environment, and I'm changing that mitigation strategy to my fire approach for my building. Those are things that we've got to know your hazard, but know your physical layout as well. So flue spaces, they allow that heat to get up to the ceiling, and then they allow a space for the water to get into the rack and control that fire, or at worst, pre-wet adjacent combustibles to limit it and let our manual operations come in when our fire service comes in. So physical layout is a really important thing. The storage height matters, right? Depending on how high we store goods, the fire grows vertically. You know, every rack tier we add, that fire can get a lot more intense. Managing our storage heights and our relative storage to the ceiling and the sprinklers, making sure we're not, you know, putting cardboard boxes 1 inch away from that sprinkler deflector. So again, that fire protection approach, know your hazard, but know your space as well, and know how the systems that are in there might interact with the particular hazard that you have. Contents are a huge driver. I'll talk about commodity classification on the next slide, but knowing what you have and knowing where it's allowed to be in your building is very important. So Brian talked a little bit, again, the title of this is Know Your Hazard. If I've got fertilizer on pallets, if I've got a cold storage area, maybe I have bulk flammable liquids, the fire protection approach for the building might be designed to limit those to a certain area. Maybe I've got an outdoor fenced in area. If I'm a retail space, I keep all those fertilizers outside. Does my team know what that hazard is, and that a sprinkler system may not be the right mitigation strategy for that potential hazard? That's why we keep them outside, because if we have something going on, we need to be able to have, you know, natural ventilation, and that's going to be part of our strategy. So knowing that strategy, knowing the hazard will allow you to develop the right fire protection approach and inform your staff and inform your teams the right way. Next slide, Brian. And part of that, again, the knowing your hazard is what do I have? What am I storing? What am I distributing? What am I selling? The good itself matters. And I think a lot of people, when they hear about commodity classification and knowing the hazard that's present, oh, well, I sell glass jars. I'm a class 1 commodity. I'm the lowest commodity class that exists in a standard like NFPA 13. And we're not going to go too deep into this, because there's a whole process. If you're into that, we've got online learning and we've got other NFPA 13 trainings. You can find them online. What matters here is there's different tiers, right? The hazard will put you in a certain category, but it's not just the good that you're selling, right? And I always use cups or glasses, drinking glasses as the example. I can go from, a non-combustible glass that I drink out of to a paper cup, to a waxed lined paper cup, to a rigid plastic cup, to a styrofoam cup. Each one of them will burn differently, right? But even when I start with that lowest kind of class, that glass jar that I don't really worry about tremendously, when I think about the fire originating there, I don't get to just look at the thing that I sell or that I store. How am I packaging it? Am I putting it in a box full of styrofoam packing peanuts? All right, well, the glass is not my problem anymore. It's that styrofoam packing peanut, or bubble wrap, or whatever that kind of, I got to protect this thing because it's fragile. I start moving up that ladder as I package my goods, and I put them and I carton them. I put them in a carton, cardboard box. Then I put them on a pallet. If I pick a wood pallet, that means something. If I pick a plastic pallet, I've increased that fire hazard, and I've increased that commodity class that I now have to protect. What that all means, I might need a bigger sprinkler system. Maybe inherently to my building and the area that I'm in, I've got a great water supply and it doesn't really impact me tremendously. Maybe it means I got to put a fire pump in. Going from that class 1 or 2 and changing the packaging, and I climb that commodity ladder, and I need a lot more water, can be a huge financial impact. So a lot of people design their buildings and say, hey, that class, the group A plastics that we sell, they're always on this side of the building. It's a really robust sprinkler system. It's really expensive. We don't want to do the whole building to protect group A plastic. We leave that stuff over here. Well, we got to make sure our operators aren't dragging group A plastics into the class 2 commodity protected space. So again, know your hazard, know what you have, know how you package it. If you change from not having a styrofoam, insert to keep things protected, and you add that in, or your owner adds that in, it changes your fire protection system approach. And these are the things that we have to know as we try to mitigate hazards. It's what we do. Next slide, Brian. And a lot of people, they look at the sprinkler itself and not really know, like, how does it work? I see them up there, right? Like, what's the deal with these things? I've seen them on TV. Yep, something happens and they all go off. Somebody lit a cigarette and now everybody's wet. We got to understand and teach people, because again, Brian mentioned, we can't teach the consumer, but we've got to educate our staff and our operators and the people in our buildings kind of how these things work. And I always tell people there's 2 ways they go off, the right way and the wrong way. The right way, when we look at this device, it's got a fusible element. In the olden days, it was a piece of metal that was designed to kind of melt away at a certain temperature. Now we use glass bulbs primarily. You'll still see fusible links. But the idea is when that fluid gets hot, the liquid expands, breaks the bulb, and water, you see where the orifice cap is, water will come down through that opening, hit the deflector, and create a spray pattern. It's only going to happen where each individual sprinkler sees that activation temperature and that fluid can expand and break the bulb. So when we see in the Hollywood movie where 30 sprinklers go off at once, that's not a real phenomenon that happens all that often. You might have very extreme events where you see 20 devices open at the same time. That's Hollywood. But that's how we want them to go off. That sprinkler that's local to the fire and it's local to the hazard, we want to see that. We want to see it quickly, and we want to get that spray pattern to develop, spread out over the floor area, pre-wet adjacent combustibles to that initial fire source, and away we go. They do open a different way, and it's not always awesome, right? Is mechanical damage. And this is where, again, as operators of warehouses, and big box stores and distribution centers, is you can see them, they're little metal things with glass things. They will break if we're not gentle enough with them. I mean, they're robust. We put them in cages where they're local to potential action, like in an in-rack arrangement, but we got to know that they're there. You want to ram a fork truck into this with a 500-pound pallet load on it, you can do some damage. So they want to open thermally, but they will open if you're a little bit violent and physical with them. And we call that mechanical damage. So we want to inform people. Here's how they work. Here's why they work. If we look at them the right way and we respect what they do for us, they're going to be great. If we don't understand that and think they're indestructible, or we don't know that they exist, again, in that in-rack arrangement, yeah, you can do some stuff, and we got to be careful of that. We also have to kind of like protect them from like elements, right? One of the biggest things I see a lot is people not understanding how they work with that thermal activation component, and they're spray painting, and the spray paint gets on the bulb, or they've got an intumescent mastic, or they've got a fire spray on fireproofing, and they're just banging around and they're covering that bulb. Well, that bulb is never going to see the temperature and expand and break. So we got to make sure we're taking care when we're doing maintenance work and we're doing cleanup work, or we've got a painting process going on. We got to respect these things, because if we damage them, we paint over that bulb, we load them with different materials, they're not going to be there when we need them. And that's why we do a lot of ITM, inspection, testing, maintenance. And we want to make sure, hey, we got to give this a kind of a clean bill of health every once in a while. So when you're looking for that ITM activity, that typically happens in NFPA 25. We have a lot of people that jump to NFPA 13. That's our design and installation standard. Phenomenal information, going to get your building built. But then for the next 50 years, I've got to inspect, test, and maintain that system and make sure that I'm doing the right things so that system is there to protect me into the future. And again, we're not going to go in depth into NFPA 25 ITM, but we can get, training. We have NFPA has training on that. We certify people for that stuff. We have certification programs, I should say, for that sort of work. So if you're interested in that, to know how do I look at this and what's a problem and what's not, there's a lot of great information out there. But today we're kind of doing the general awareness kind of piece of this. Brian, next slide. And this kind of gives you a look at, and this is something when I teach sprinkler classes, and I work a lot with operators. In my past life, I had clients that were facility managers or building operators at retailers. They see the sprinkler itself like we just saw on that previous slide, but they don't understand the scope of the system, right? Is we see the sprinkler, maybe we see an exposed pipe at the ceiling. When you look at the lower level of this drawing, there's a lot of other stuff, right? We've got check valves and we've got gate valves. We've got fire department connections where they can pump water in. Again, we don't have to all become experts on this, but understanding, hey, we got a domestic water leak and we're running around shutting off valves. When you shut off a water valve that supplies a sink and you leave it closed, somebody eventually is going to go, hey, I'm not getting any water out of that faucet or that sink. When you do it to a fire protection system, nobody ever really knows, right? You don't know until the sprinkler operates and nothing comes out of it. So again, knowing how your system works, the water's flowing from the underground piping, or maybe you have a tank and pump arrangement and then it's going to flow through this valve. And get that feel for, again, I don't need to be an expert. I don't need to design them and lay them out, but what are those components and how do I interface with them? What can I do to this system? We talk a lot about management of change in warehouses. A lot of it is just knowing, okay, we've had an event here. How do I interface with this equipment to know that I'm back up and online? So no, I tell people it's not a tremendously complicated system, but understand it, respect it, and know how it's part of your building safety approach. Have the right people have that kind of base level of knowledge with this stuff. Next slide, Brian. Fire alarm systems, another piece of the kind of the puzzle that we deal with in a warehouse or in a distribution facility, is we've talked a lot about the intervention of a sprinkler system and kind of like doing that, using those systems to deal with the fire itself. What about the people? What about the notification out to the fire department, right? There are other systems that aren't simply dealing with the fire itself. And a lot of that is our fire alarm detection and notifying systems. And you can see here, there's a lot of different components, right? We've got audible notification appliances, visible notification appliances, combination appliances. We've got detection appliances. We see some smoke detectors. I saw a question in the Q&A do we need smoke detectors in warehouses and big box stores? In a lot of spaces, we don't when they're fully sprinklered, which here in the US, most of these places are now fully sprinklered. There's a bunch of reasons for that. One, in that we have some heat detection, right? The sprinkler is essentially a heat detector. It's sensing heat, it operates, and we have a flow switch so that when water starts flowing, there's a switch in the pipe that when the water flows, it trips a paddle, and that's our notification. That's how we know something's going on, and we're going to alert the fire department to respond. We're going to roll trucks. We're going to do all that stuff. Partly because you're going to get a lot of false alarms when you're in a warehouse space, when you're in a big box store, and you got, if we've been to these spaces, you got a lot of different products. You're grabbing a 50-pound bag of ready mix and you throw it, and a big puff kind of puffs up in the air. Where's that going, right? Is that going to get in my smoke detector every time a contractor's in there loading their truck full of stuff? So smoke detectors are phenomenal, but there are limitations, right? I'm aware of I'm aware of certain warehouses and distribution centers that will use air sampling, and they have a baseline of what that kind of not amazing condition where there's some debris and there's some dust in the air, and they're really looking for a drastic change in that environment rather than going from a kind of pristine state to there's something here. They know there's stuff in the air and they're looking for a more drastic change. So I do see that. And I've worked for an insurance company. I know in some of those higher risk facilities, those are all things that happen. But again, when Brian set this up and said, talk a little bit about the system, I always go back to what's my hazard, right? The system may be a great solution. It may not be a great solution. I've got to know what the hazard is, what my environment is, what kind of processes I have. And that'll help me dictate what the right thing is. For this, with fire alarm systems, one thing I think that's really important is making sure we're relying on these devices to notify people. We can't be blocking them, right? If I've got a visual appliance that's on the wall and I start putting cardboard boxes in front of it, if I have patrons, that are hard of hearing, they can't hear the audible alarm, or I'm in a warehouse distribution setting where there's a lot of noise, right? There's things beeping, fork trucks driving around. I need to have these things unobstructed because I've got the general public in this building. I don't want to hear, in the news the next day, people couldn't get out because they couldn't see the strobe or they couldn't hear the alarm. We've got to make sure when we have this as part of our fire protection approach for our warehouse or building, that we're in a good place to notify people and allow these things to do their job. Brian, did we want to go back a slide and have Volley comment a little bit on the sprinkler system?
Yeah, Volley, I remember you wanted to mention something about sprinkler systems and commodities.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of reiterate, commodity type. When we look at NFPA 13, Chapter 20, the first thing mentioned is commodity type. Especially in this space, we're constantly onboarding and discontinuing different items. So at the end of the day, sometimes we have to step back from our profits and margins and make sure that we're meeting what's required by code. So at the end of the day, I would say commodity type is very important. You got to know your hazards.
Awesome. Thanks, Wally. And he's absolutely right. Again, we can talk all day about the design and the layout and you've got to know what you're dealing with. It's such an important thing because, again, an engineer might build a strategy thinking there's going to be one type of product or one commodity there. And when we change that, I don't want to say the system above us or the systems around us aren't valuable, but it changes their value. And we've got to be aware of that. Next slide, actually 2 slides ahead, Brian, thanks. So we've talked a little bit about dealing with the fire and now notifying people. And one of the things I failed to mention on the previous slide, the fire alarm control panel, right? When the fire department responds to that fire, that's where they're going to go. It's going to give them information. So not unlike the notification appliances, we don't want to be blocking them, right? We don't want them to be hidden. We don't want that fire alarm control panel to be in a place where the fire department arrives. They're trying to figure out, where are we going? What are we doing? Well, where's the panel? That's where all my information is. Is it obstructed? Is it blocked? Is it in a condition where I can get to it, access it, and start dealing with, as the fire department, our manual intervention. So it's an important thing. But again, stepping from the sprinkler to the fire alarm, these things are all tied together. They're part of our approach. Life safety is kind of that next step, right? Is we've got to be ready. Okay, we've identified the fire either via a flow switch, or maybe it happened in the office area and it was a smoke detector. Now we've got to move people, right? We've got to deal with the life safety aspect. And I know we think of life safety in the high-rise environment. Think about it in a warehouse where you might have the public in there and they're not familiar with the layout, or if it's a distribution center, they're massive. They're massive, 1 million square feet. There's a long way to go to that exit. We got to make sure that they're where they're supposed to be, that we've got the right number of doors, that access to the exit is unobstructed. If we have aisleways, or we're showing a stair there, maybe we've got a little 2-story arrangement, that we're not taking the cardboard boxes that are in the way and just sticking them in the stairwell. That's someone's means of escape, and it's all integrated with that fire alarm and signaling system and with that sprinkler system. It's a partially passive and partially active system, right? We had someone at some point size those doors and size the stairwells. Those are passive, they exist. It's our job to maintain them free and clear so that they're there. But we also do have active components to our egress system. We might have a smoke control system. We might have emergency lighting. We might have egress lighting that's going to get us from that area where we're at during the fire event to, a safe place. So what does all that mean? We've got to maintain that egress path free and clear, where we do have those active systems that assist in our life safety and in our egress. Are we doing our maintenance? Are we taking care of those things? Are we reporting emergency lights there? Oh, I was walking the building. Part of my job is to walk the building, and some of the E-lights are out, or some of the exit signs aren't illuminated. When we think about, what can happen during a fire event, it can be something simple like that. Someone seeing that light, seeing that egress sign that helps get them out of the building. Next slide, Brian. And here's another link scenario. And I think it's interesting because I don't think a lot of people think about their egress system, right? And the hardware that we use. You can see node number 8. Again, this is one of our scenarios of making sure your egress system is safe and ready to go. Do I have the right hardware on my doors for people that are exiting? Do I have the ability for them to traverse level to level? They've got handrails. The stairs have been sized with a rise-run pattern that's prescribed to the code. We see the landing, and this is a big one. This is the one that we, as building operators, and again, know the hazard kind of when we play that game. One of the biggest hazards is not giving people space that they need to egress, right? One of the things people don't realize about landings, a lot of them serve as areas of refuge for people who can't go up and down stairs. That landing, a lot of times, is sized to allow them to sit and wait and have assistance as they're being escorted out of the building. If we're putting ladders there and we're putting boxes of toilet paper because of the restroom, whatever the excuse is, that's someone's egress path. When we have that fire, we want to make sure we're maintaining all of these things free and clear. The other part of it is you do have some of your active system components in there. You can see over by node number 3, you might have a standpipe in there. The fire department might be coming in there. It might not just be getting people out. That's where they might make a hose connection, and they might start doing some manual firefighting based off of that point, because that stair enclosure it's passive construction, it's passive fire protection, but it's rated and it's safe. And that's a place where they know they can be to set up their operations, but not if we've got people in the way, not if we've got boxes in the way and ladders and stored goods. So we really got to be careful about some of these life safety systems, and making sure we're not saying, oh, all the sprinklers are there, we'll be fine. The whole thing works together, right? And we've got to be aware of those things. Brian, next slide.
Great. Yeah. So I'm happy to take this. Thank you, Matt, so much for reviewing those. Again, a ton of great points. I see a lot of questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those next slide. But I just wanted to mention a couple of resources that NFPA has for if you are looking to either learn more about this or dive into some of these topics a little deeper. We have different webinars. So we have other webinars we've done in the past, similar to this one, that have been recorded that you can check out. We have different reports, and these reports can come from the Fire Protection Research Foundation, which is a partner of NFPA's, that they work on developing these reports to be able to allow our committee members to write better codes and standards and answer questions that the industry might have. So those are all, again, available for free to check out. We have lots of good blogs. If you haven't seen them, check them out. We have a ton of them. I think we just talked about publishing got over 100 different blogs on fire protection, life safety, industrial hazard chemical topics. So check those out. There's a lot of good resources in those. NFPA link, as Matt mentioned, it's a great resource for looking at exactly what the codes and standards say. I like these scenarios that we've been looking at. They're a great resource for someone who's just learning the codes or just learning the industry and trying to figure out where are these requirements located. It really helps cut down a lot of time trying to search through the books themselves. And then we have training as well. Very recently, we developed a training for people who work at warehouses to be awareness levels, to increase their awareness levels of these fire protection and life safety features so that they're able to identify something that's gone wrong before you have to wait for your ITM, your inspection or testing or maintenance time frame to come up. You'd be able to say, hey, I'm an employee. I noticed that one of these sprinklers it's dented. I know it's not supposed to be dented because I know at least this is where the water comes out of, and that's, to help it make an umbrella pattern. So trying to give employees a level of awareness that they need to know, right? Not every employee needs to be an expert on all fire protection systems, but they do need to be at least aware of what's going on with them, what they could do to potentially compromise these systems, as well as what the public can do to compromise these systems and how to prevent those. So we have a lot of good training resources on that as well. Check out our landing page, nfpa.org/warehousefires. I believe that's also where this webinar recording is going to live and be located afterwards. So if you want to share this with fellow employees or people in the industry, please feel free to do that. It should be posted within a week or two after today. So if you have any other questions, also feel free to email either Matt or myself for these resources. We're happy to provide a lot of information on that. All right. So without further ado, we'll start diving into some of these questions. I've seen some have been typed in, so we'll take a look at those and try to address what we can. And then I'm happy to take one, Matt, I've been looking at when you were presenting, so I'll
yeah, you fire away, Brian. I'll grab a few and we'll go from there.
Cool. All right, so we go a little back and forth. This question, and this is a question that I get a lot for warehouses, is comes in and says NFPA 13 forbids certain types of arrangements and storage arrangements, such as bin boxes, but people are often confronted with warehouses that use those arrangements. So what can designers do? And this is tough. It puts a lot more work on the designer because basically there's this rule and requirement that says don't do that because of all these repercussions, because of it's going to hold water in those, right? It's not going to be able to let water reach a fire, and that's going to allow that fire enough time to spread and overwhelm the sprinkler system. So that's why we don't allow those. But you're right, they exist sometimes. And this is going to just be a conversation, and we might have to look at performance-based requirements. We might have to look at trying to find an equivalent means of protecting these buildings. And this just puts a lot more work basically on the designer to be able to justify whatever type of protection system that you use. You have to have that open communication with your AHJ, who ultimately is the person who's going to approve this system or approve the building for occupancy. So being able to work closely with them, looking at maybe a performance-based design approach, saying, how can we make this equivalent to, as if we were storing something else? Maybe there's going to be extra in-rack sprinklers. Maybe there's going to be other different fire protection features or systems that you need to incorporate to make it safe. Again, ultimately, we can't say do X, Y, or Z because as you mentioned, NFPA 13 already says it. It says don't use those arrangements because they're outside the scope. We don't have enough testing to be able to understand what would be a safe equivalent approach to protecting those. So we do kind of leave that to that performance-based design and up to the designer themselves. Do you want to add anything to that, Matt? For the
yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say is this, and it's probably, I always find a way to get this in no matter what the topic is. As a designer, one of the things that NFPA 13 has done to help designers is they require the owner to submit upfront how the building is going to be used. And that includes the storage means, methods, storage heights, all that information. And I talk a lot again, because I had worked for a consulting firm and an insurance company. One of the things I think where designers get stuck a lot is people think warehouses are warehouses. As we've said today, know your hazard. The warehouse distribution world everything can look a little different. One half of a building can be entirely different than the other. Make sure you're using that section in NFPA 13 as a designer, design engineer to ask the owner, how are you using this building? If they're going to use things like bin boxes or movable shelving, or they've got different strategies, it's critical upfront for the design team to understand that, so that one, they can make the right design decision, but two, and in this case, flag those non-compliance issues, because in some jurisdictions, they'll fly right through because the AHJ might not understand the concern over bin box storage. In other ones, they might. So I really encourage designers, make sure you're getting that owner's questionnaire kind of filled out. I'll grab a couple questions as Brian was talking. Unfortunately, a lot of questions here, which is awesome. I love it. Unfortunately, we're probably not going to have time to get to all of them. But there's a few things I saw right away. For lighting equipment, is it the metal halide lighting? That's a very popular style of light that gets used. It's considered high intensity discharge lighting, and they do fail sometimes, and the glass bulbs can break and they shatter and they can fall down. I know it's been a nightmare for a lot of people because you might have something that's fairly combustible below it, and now you have this hot glass raining down and doing that stuff. So it is an issue. They're permitted, they're used. I know there were some recalls years ago. So I always tell people, like, just be aware of recalls. Like it's a great thing to kind of get on those consumer product lists to know things like that, whether it's valves or whether it's lighting components that are causing issues. Keep an eye on that. So it's a good comment. It's an issue, but it's not the only issue with the lighting. I saw a question in here. Oh, maybe it moved. What type of K factor do we use in a warehouse? And it's a question that I can't answer it because it depends, right? That's the part for the person who asked it, is where we don't start with the sprinkler, we start with the hazard, and we start, to Vali's point earlier, what's your commodity? What are you storing? What are we worried about? Then I can start going through NFPA 13 and I can go through the storage chapters and say, okay, I'm storing this. I've got a class 3 commodity, or I've got a group A plastic. Now I'm going to work through, how tall am I storing it? How close to the ceiling is the storage? I'm going to answer all of those questions. And really, I used to teach a storage design class. There's probably 6 or 8 pieces of information I need to know as a designer about the space before I can pick the sprinkler. So it's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked it. The answer is, I've got to get all of that kind of prerequisite information through my brain: storage height, commodity class, aisle width, all this stuff. Okay, cool. Now I have a design, and really it doesn't even end with picking the K factor. That's not the next thing. It's what's my approach? Am I going with a control mode density area approach? Am I going with a CMSA, control mode specific application approach? Am I going with an ESFR, early suppression fast response? The standard NFPA 13, based on how you answer those storage height, commodity, all that stuff, it's going to drive you to options. What are my options based on what I'm storing? I might have an arrangement where there is no option in one of those three CMDA, CMSA, ESFR categories. I might be limited to one or two, and that will end up dictating my K factor. The question we get a lot around this is if I'm doing like spec warehousing, what do I do? I don't know what's going to be in there. I don't have that commodity to steer me. And you'll see a lot of people, the popular thing over the years has been pick a K25, throw them at the ceiling. It protects a bunch of stuff. And in a spec warehouse, maybe that is a good approach. Again, I go back to the owner and I kind of try to, all right, well, are you expecting group A plastic storage? Because if you are, I gotta plan some other stuff here. It's not gonna be a straight K25. I might need vertical barriers. I might need to do some other things here. So again, the more we get from the owner, I think that's like a really kind of important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Brian. I know we're coming close to the end now, so I just wanted to take a moment and pass it back to Vali to see if you had any other comments or notes. Again, I'd like to first of all say thank you so much for your participation in this. He's been pivotal in being able to provide a little bit more insight into the Lowe's perspective of these warehouses. So we appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. I appreciate the time to speak. And if anybody has any questions offline, especially our HJs out there, feel free to contact me. I think, Brian, you're going to share my email address, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Which I'll, here we go. Here's all of our contact information. If you do want to reach out to us with questions or comments, anything like that, feel free to do that. I know we're coming up on the end of this, so I'll try to go through and answer some of the questions in the chat. And then we have come up on about 40 of them. So I'll go through and try to provide those just to those individuals. I don't know if I'll get to all of them, but we'll move through. Again, feel free to follow up with questions by sending them over email. And then again, Matt, do you have anything else to add before we hand it back over to Renee?
No, I just appreciate everybody being here. I apologize. There's a lot more questions than we have time right now. But there's a lot of resources on the NFPA website. There's a lot of training opportunities. And I see the questions. The answers aren't always simple. Oh, just go to section 4.9 and there's your answer. A lot of this, there is some learning to be done. There's going to be a little bit of pain, a little bit of struggle, and it's understanding that beginning piece to get to the solution. Think about that causation, think about the hazard, and then we'll get to the strategy and the right design approach. So great questions. Thank you everybody for being here. I'll stop. Sorry.
Great. Thank you. And then we'll pass over to Renee to close us out.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for all the questions. If you have any questions, you can always post them to custserve@nfpa.org. You will see on the screen Vali Murray, vali.murray@lowes.com. Matt Klaus is mklaus@nfpa.org. Brian O'Connor is boconnor@nfpa.org. And for more information on the upcoming webinars, you can go to www.nfpa.org/webinars. And a recording of this webinar will be made available. You'll receive an email notification when it has been posted. And then the last screen is on behalf of NFPA. We'd just like to thank you, and on behalf of the presenters and myself, thank you for joining us today, and we appreciate all your participation. Thank you.